joining us online. I have been excited about this event for months, so I should just confess that our presenter, our speaker today, our guest, Steve Meyer, he and I have been friends. We've actually worked together, I almost hate to say it, for 25 years and known each other longer than that. We met obviously in nursery initially, but I was just reflecting on this last night, and he has a very important series of books, including a book that we'll talk some more about, but I think it is especially apropos for our moment. I mean, anyone that knows anything about American history knows that there was something we'll just call the founding consensus, in which, of course, the American founders did not establish a national church or religion at the federal level at the time of the founding, but there was a background culture that was embedded with particular assumptions. We might call those theistic assumptions. So the American founders, across the denominational spectrum, from the most devout to the most skeptical, nevertheless agreed about certain things. They agreed that the existence of a creator, God, was not just a sectarian belief, but a public truth, something that could be known by reason, that there's a creator and that there are natural moral laws that ground our positive laws, the laws that we have in the Constitution and the Bill of Rights. This was taken for granted at the time of the founding and is still very much a part of our history. Unfortunately, sometime in the late 19th, early 20th century, a completely different idea came to the fore, and it worked its way through our courts in a series of important court decisions and effectively changed the background public philosophy that we all live and move in every day. We'll just call that secularism. And in that vision, the idea of a creator or a transcendent source of meaning and morality is treated as a narrow or sectarian or private belief that has no place in the public square. Well, that's happened on one track. On the other track, the natural world has continued to exist and continued to testify to something else. In the last few decades, a group of scholars, philosophers, natural scientists, lawyers, all sorts of people have been very interested in this question of public evidence for the existence of purpose and design generally, and for the existence of a creator in particular. And so that's what we're here to talk about this morning, very briefly. So let me tell you a little bit about Steve Meyer. I told you that I have known him for many years and worked with him. He also shaped very many of my most controversial opinions, probably, at least in part to Steve. But he is the founding director and the director of the Center for Science and Culture at the Discovery Institute in Seattle, Washington. He has a PhD in the philosophy of science from Cambridge University. He is the author and editor of many books and important articles, many high-profile public debates with new atheists, old atheists, and everyone in between, which you can find on YouTube. And he has this trilogy of very important books, starting with The Signature in the Cell, which was a book of the year for the Times Literary Supplement when it came out. His follow-up book, Darwin's Doubt, was a New York Times bestseller. And then this third book, which came out just sort of right at the end of the COVID lockdowns, The Return of the God Hypothesis, which makes a more explicitly theological argument and in some ways kind of sums up the scientific work that he's done over the years. So please join me in welcoming Steve Meyer. Well, Steve, welcome to Heritage. It's so great to have you here.
It's great to be back. The first public event I did promoting Signature in the Cell in 2009 was held right here.
Yeah. That's terrific. Yeah. And so we've been talking about doing something on your book since it came out, but COVID messed up everyone's schedules, and so
messed up everything, yeah.
Absolutely. Right. And so I want to just get right into it. Obviously, we can't sort of cover all this in the detail that it deserves. And so I just want to sort of set the stage, and then we will bring it to bear on this kind of larger policy or political question. So first, define intelligent design. This seems so tedious, but the term is so often misused and mischaracterized. I think we should start with that.
Intelligent design is the idea that there are certain features of life and the universe that are best explained by the action or activity of a designing intelligence or agent rather than as the result of an undirected material process, such as, for example, natural selection acting on random mutations in the biological realm. So it's the idea that the activity of a designing agent is detectable by certain features that we see in nature.
Okay, so intelligent design per se then isn't an argument for the existence of God.
No, it's an argument for the existence of a mind of some kind.
Okay.
And as you know, and that's how I developed the argument in the first two books. I took it only that far.
Right.
But then my readers kept asking me this pesky question, well, who do you think the designing agent responsible for example, the digital code in the DNA is? Do you think it's an immanent intelligence within the cosmos, a space alien of some kind? Or do you think it's a more transcendent intelligence, AKA God?
Right.
And so in the third book, I've come clean. And I never
This was always private before.
I made it clear before I was never a fan of what's called panspermia, the space alien designer hypothesis. I think it's got some liabilities which I can explain. But in the third book, I broadened the scope of investigation from just looking at the evidence of design in biology, and to looking at evidence of design in physics and cosmology.
Right.
The beginning of the universe poses a particularly difficult challenge for people of a materialistic worldview mindset, because the best evidence we have suggests that the material universe, or the physical universe of matter, space, time, and energy itself began to exist, before which there was no matter to do the causing. So it's very hard to explain the origin of the universe materialistically. But it's also hard to explain the origin of the universe and its what's called its fine-tuning by reference to any intelligence within the cosmos that might have evolved later on after the beginning, because no being within the cosmos could be responsible for the finely tuned conditions that would have made its later evolution possible. That would be getting the cause after the effect.
Exactly.
Causes need to go before the effect.
Generally.
And similarly, no intelligence within the cosmos can be responsible for the origin of the universe itself.
Right.
And so when you broaden the scope of the inquiry to include the evidence we have about the beginning of the universe and its fine-tuning from the beginning, you get evidence which I think unequivocally supports a theistic design hypothesis, or a transcendent form of intelligence is the best explanation.
Yeah, because we're talking about the whole thing at this point.
We're talking about the whole show.
So so in the book you just focus, I know you think there's lots of evidence that in support of the God hypothesis, but in the book you focus on the beginning of the universe, the fine-tuning of the laws, constants, and initial conditions. We'll kind of take those together. And then the origin of life. So they move from chemistry to biology, and then the origin of the complex structures in biology. So let's take those one by one. So you've already sort of talked a bit about the idea that if you have a beginning to the physical universe, an eternal material universe is now a bad candidate for explanation if you're a materialist.
Right. So this is the huge story of 20th century cosmology, and that is that as we come into the 20th century, it's pretty much the default view that the physical universe is eternal and self-existent. It was an idea that Aristotle had back to the ancient Greeks. It was kind of a default way of thinking among the late 19th century physicists, and then in the 19-teens and especially the 20s, the scientists began to get hints of a very different cosmology. The first discovery was that the universe was expanding, and this was a consequence of the discovery of what's called the red shift. The light coming from distant galaxies was being stretched out as if all the galaxies were moving away from us in every quadrant of the night sky. It took several decades to verify this in all the quadrants of the night sky. One of the key figures there was Alan Sandage, who was a grad student at Edwin Hubble, who was one of the first scientists to get the hint of the expansion.
Right, Hubble, the American astronomer.
He's a lawyer who came into astronomy, so lawyers have done some good things for science. And
maybe not recently. But
anyway, lawyers always being the brunt of jokes. It's good to point out that this one did some great work in science. And in any case, the idea of expanding universe is the galaxies are moving away in all directions of the night sky. This was coupled with an idea from general relativity that space itself is expanding. It's not just that the galaxies are expanding into a pre-existing space. Space is expanding and creating that
bringing the galaxies along.
Bringing the galaxies along. In any case, when you wind the clock backwards, we see in the forward direction of time this evidence of expansion, but if you wind the clock backwards in your mind's eye,
Right.
it turns out that you get to a limiting point where you can't back extrapolate any further. If everything is expanding in a roughly spatially symmetric way, or a spherically symmetric way, as you wind the clock backwards, you get to a point where all the galactic matter would have congealed to a point marking the beginning of the expansion, but arguably also the beginning of the universe itself, and arguably because you can't back extrapolate any further.
Yeah.
You know, you get to that limiting case. And there were further developments in the 1960s, in particular with Stephen Hawking, who was working on black hole physics during his PhD years. And he developed what were the first of several what were called singularity theorems, where he showed that based on Einstein's notion of general relativity, that again you had that limiting case as you back extrapolate. Einstein's idea was that matter is actually curving the fabric of space, or what he called space-time, such that there are preferred lines of trajectory for even light around a planetary or solar body. And so Hawking got to thinking about that and realized that astronomers were telling us that the galaxies are moving outward, which means that matter is getting more and more diffuse in the forward direction of time. But that means in the reverse direction of time, matter is getting more densely concentrated. And if matter is more densely concentrated, then the curvature of space becomes progressively more tighter and tighter.
Yeah.
And so you, again, as you go back further in time, as that matter would have been more and more densely concentrated as you approach that beginning point, the space becomes tighter and tighter, more tightly curved, and you reach a point where eventually the curvature of space goes to an infinite. That's the limiting case.
Yes.
You can't go back any further.
What's the volume?
And the volume then is zero.
Okay, so let's all just sit on that for a moment. All right.
Well, and then you get to the point where there's no place to put anything.
Yes.
Okay, so now there's a way around that
Sure.
conclusion, as there almost always is in science. There's a loophole in which the very tiniest part, the tiniest smidgen of space and the tiniest minuscule portion of time after the beginning, it's called Planck time,
Yes.
is a time when quantum effects may have predominated. So scientists have attempted to come up with what they call a quantum cosmology, hoping to circumvent this problem of the beginning. But there's kind of some untold aspects of that.
Yeah.
One is that in no current theory of cosmology do they actually get around the beginning. The singularity is presupposed in all their ideas about what would have happened at the beginning and afterwards. But secondly, these models of the origin of the universe privilege mathematics. They envision a pre-existing, purely mathematical realm of possibility out of which our actual universe emerges. And so you get this strange paradox that you have math preceding matter, that somehow math is creating the matter. But
not just preceding, but actually doing the
in
creating.
some way causing it.
Yeah.
Or something.
Yeah.
And one of the great advocates of quantum cosmology, Alexander Vilenkin, has reflected on this paradox. And he says, before there's matter, space, time, and energy, what tablet could these laws, these physical laws written in mathematical form, have been written on? And he said, matter or math exists in the realm of the mind. Are we therefore saying that the material universe has emerged from a mind, or that a mind precedes the material universe? And so even the attempt to circumvent the conclusion that there was an absolute beginning has A, not gotten rid of the beginning, and B, created this strange paradoxical result where it looks as though there must have been a pre-existing mind to generate the universe.
Which isn't where you want to go if you're a materialist.
Exactly. So it's sort of the materialists are checkmated in whatever cosmological model they choose to adopt, whether the standard Big Bang or inflationary cosmological model, which is a version of the Big Bang that has a definite beginning, whereby materialistic explanations are impossible, an adequate materialistic explanation is impossible, or they have to go in a quantum cosmological direction, which has its own, I argue, theistic implications.
Yes, you do. And don't go any farther into that because it's super complicated. Exactly. And I'll tell you, if you want Steve's full, loving, patient response to these alternatives, it's in the last several chapters of this book. So we're not going to do it here, but don't think he hasn't answered it somewhere. I was just telling him beforehand, it's like, an amazing amount of saintly patience dealing with some of these, I think, kind of more far-fetched
Well, I think
options.
that's part of the story, is that
Yeah.
scientific atheism, though it's still presented as sweet reason in
Right.
culture, has become very weird.
Very weird.
Okay,
Yeah.
so you have, in the sense that it has multiple, what philosophers of science call auxiliary hypotheses, sort of special pleading. Well, our
Right.
theory doesn't work taken at face value, but if we add this premise and this premise and this premise, we might be able to explain things. So in the area of origin of life biology, one of the common recognitions has been among very top scientists is that the conditions on the early Earth were simply incompatible with a naturalistic chemical evolutionary origin for life, for the very first life, for the very first cell. And so in 1980-81, Francis Crick writes a little book called Life Itself, in which he proposes that because of those hostile conditions, that life must have somehow been seeded here from another planet. And this is the first formulation of what's known as panspermia.
Right.
And part of that is the evidence, which we haven't talked about yet, but the evidence of the digital code in DNA.
Yeah. Don't go there yet.
Yeah, right.
Yeah,
right.
yeah,
So,
exactly. So that's.
but that's one of the exotic new atheist hypotheses. Instead of theistic design, we have alien designers, we have the multiverse concept, and we have this quantum cosmological universe from nothing but math idea.
Yeah.
So it's
gotten strange.
It's gotten strange. And don't forget the we live in a simulation.
No, that's right. Yeah, exactly. I mean, if somebody believed the sort of narrative that, well, science, natural science, has been this long march of the success of purely materialistic explanations, the 20th century very much contradicted those
Materialism
expectations.
is broken down. It's just not working.
And I think that's very much the story, honestly, of your career, is highlighting the realities of nature that contradict that vision. So you implied in your explanation a minute ago, so we talked about the beginning of the universe. So that's a kind of cosmological question, but also there's this thing called fine-tuning of the laws, constants, and initial conditions. So just explain that very briefly.
Which you and Guillermo Gonzalez have written about so persuasively as well. But right from the very beginning of the universe, it turns out that the basic parameters of the universe that were established at the beginning, or most of which were, are what scientists call finely tuned or exquisitely finely tuned. And you and I both use the same illustration of the Goldilocks universe.
Yes.
You know, that you have the strength of gravity. It's not too strong, not too weak, and falls within a very narrow range or tolerance in which it's possible to build, for example, carbon, which is the necessary molecule for living systems. But electromagnetism, same thing, not too strong, not too weak. And the ratio between those two forces needs to be perfectly balanced to allow for the production of a life-friendly universe. All the four fundamental forces of physics have that same quality. They have a strength that falls within a very narrow range or tolerance outside of which life would be impossible. The mass of the quark, the elementary particles, same thing, not too heavy, not too light. The speed of light, not too fast, not too slow. The expansion rate of the universe, and in particular, the force that physicists think that's driving it, called the cosmological constant, needs to be finely tuned, in that case, to an exquisite degree. 1 part in 10 to the 90th power is the accepted range. So to get that's the force that's causing the expansion. And to get a sense of just how finely tuned that is, the odds of getting that right would be roughly equal to the odds of a blindfolded man floating in free space trying to identify one elementary particle, but not just in our universe where there are 10 to the 80th elementary particles, but in 10 billion universes, in any one of 10 billion universes our size. And so the odds of getting even one of these parameters right, let alone all of them, and many of them are independent probabilities of each other, it beggars description.
Crazy small.
Yeah,
absolutely.
So many physicists have tumbled to the common sense conclusion that this fine-tuning suggests a fine-tuner. In fact, Fred Hoyle, who was a staunch scientific atheist and who rejected the Big Bang Theory, in fact, he gave the term Big Bang to the theory as a pejorative to try to make fun of it.
It stuck.
It stuck. Later reverses his worldview on the basis of his own discovery of some of these fine-tuning parameters. And he's quoted later in his life as saying, a common sense interpretation of the data, meaning the fine-tuning data, suggests that a super intellect has monkeyed with physics and chemistry in order to make life possible.
Yeah.
And so I always like to say that it's amazing the way that monkeys always make it into these origin
They
debates.
do.
You either have them at the keys at the typewriter, or they're monkeying with the fine tuning.
Yeah, they always show up. Okay, so this is probably the moment to explain, I think, a key insight of intelligent design scholars that, of course, you're talking a lot about the improbabilities of these things, but the inference to design, the way in which we recognize design, it's not just about improbability, is it? It's about something else.
Well, and this is tomorrow, for Saturday, at our conference that we're doing here in D.C. We'll be interviewing William Dembski about the 25th anniversary of his groundbreaking book, The Design Inference. And Dembski had a couple key insights. People from the ancient Greeks forward, I mean, in Aristotle and Plato, and then in Cicero, and a Roman writer, Maimonides and Aquinas during the Middle Ages, all the great writers in the scientific revolution, Kepler, Boyle, Newton, they all were perceiving evidence of design in nature.
Right.
But no one really was able to explicitly articulate what it is about nature or anything else that might lead us to conclude that a designing agent was involved.
We knew it intuitively.
We knew it intuitively. Yeah. People would grope for the right description of what the criteria were by which we detected design. If you look behind me, there's a series of letters, and all of us recognize that phrase, the Heritage Foundation, was put there by an intelligent person, okay? That information seems to have something to do with detecting intelligence.
Right.
Our colleague, William Dembski, in the groundbreaking book with Cambridge University Press in 1998, called The Design Inference, first noted that it's one of the functions of intelligence, of rationality, to detect the activity of other rational agents. We do it all the time, whether it's with a stop sign, or his famous example was the faces on Mount Rushmore, or whether it's with written text or a configuration of parts in an engine. We can immediately detect the activity of an intelligent agent. But then he asked, well, what is it about those different systems that leads to that detection? And so in using the Mount Rushmore example, he said, well, obviously, the improbability of finding those exact shapes on a mountain face is part of it.
Right.
But he pointed out that the rubble at the bottom of the mountain, where the sculptor had chipped away, was improbably arranged as well.
Yeah, probably nowhere else in the universe.
Nobody wants to say, well, that rubble there was, those rocks were placed in that exact way.
This was pre-modern art kind of thing.
Exactly. Jackson Pollock. So improbability clearly has something to do with it, but it's not the whole story. He said there's an additional criterion that's very important that people have overlooked, and that he called a specification. And what he meant by that, it was a particular kind of pattern, or it was a pattern match. All right, so you have the faces on Mount Rushmore, but what causes us to recognize design is not only that they're highly improbable given the laws of physics, but also that those faces match a pattern that we recognize independently from other experience.
And match it tightly. It's not like a giraffe-shaped cloud. It's very precise.
Well, and that has to do with the probability condition. But in any case, what's the pattern? Well, we recognize the pattern of the human face, and even more specifically, the pattern of Jefferson or Lincoln or Washington, Roosevelt, from pictures in history books or pictures on the money or whatever. So we recognize that pattern, and then that combination triggers an awareness of design.
Right.
Now, one of the innovations in Dembski's way of thinking is that he's also been able to characterize that pattern matching in a way that is more generalizable. He's saying what's really going on with a pattern match is that you have a description that can be provided very concisely. In other words, I see, well, that's very improbable. Oh, but those are the faces of the presidents. There's my concise description. And what that means is, I had in working with Bill on this, also thought that, well, a functional description or a set of functional requirements is also a kind of a specification. And his new way of cashing out specification incorporates that. So if you say, oh, those are the faces of the presidents, or, oh, that's an internal combustion engine. I see what that does. Or, oh, those are the parameters that are necessary to make life possible in the universe.
That's the specification.
That's the specification.
Okay.
So you've got this highly improbable array of conditions, but compared with all the other highly improbable conditions that there might be, oh, those are the ones that make life possible.
And those are the ones that we're always interested in.
Exactly.
And that scientists
they
want
attract
to
our
explain.
attention.
Yeah.
And so a functional description or a set of functional, if a highly improbable event exemplifies a functional description or a set of functional requirements, that also triggers an awareness of design.
Okay.
So, that's a message that welcomes us to the Heritage Foundation. I can say, oh, that's so when informational text ends up being specified in the Dembskian sense.
Yes. And so this is a perfect setup then for these two other major pieces of evidence you focus on in the book. So the origin of life and the origin of sort of complex organismal life and the history of life, but both have to do with this information.
Right. And notice just before I get into that, that what we're talking about is something that's very public. Every human being has the capacity to recognize design if we see these two criteria exemplified.
And you don't actually even need to know at this level who the designer is. To be able to recognize that, okay, we know the features. I don't actually need to know who the sculptor is.
And you don't need to be a religious person to see this, or everybody can see this. We all recognize that somebody sculpted Mount Rushmore or the David.
Okay.
Now take this to the biological realm then, because I came into this. Bill was thinking about these issues in the framework of one particular philosophical framework and mathematical framework. I was thinking about them. It was called a complexity theoretic framework.
Right.
I was thinking about it in terms of information, because what you have in the DNA molecule, and this goes back to Francis Crick, who was the great genius of the molecular biological revolution. He worked with Watson in 1953. Watson also a genius, but they were able to elucidate the structure of the DNA molecule, which by the early 50s, most biologists thought had something to do with the transmission of hereditary traits. There's great issue in biology going back to the Greeks. Like begets like. We all see that, but why? Why is it that offspring are like their parents? There must be some sort of signal that's being transmitted. And by the early 1950s, scientists thought it had something to do with DNA. Watson Crick elucidate the structure of DNA. It's the famed double helix molecule.
Like a twisted ladder.
The twisted ladder. On the interior of the ladder, there are these subunits that are called bases or nucleotide bases. And even in 53, they suggested in their first paper that the molecule was set up to carry information in some way. In 1957, Crick formulates something called the sequence hypothesis, which I think in many ways is an even more significant achievement than the elucidation of the structure, because what he realizes, and interestingly, he's a code breaker in World War II, and he comes into biology with that background. He realizes that those four nucleotide bases that are functioning like alphabetic characters in a written text, or like, say, zeros and ones in a section of software, which is to say it's not their physical properties, their weight or their shape, that is giving them their function, but rather it's their arrangement in accord with an independent symbol convention, which is later discovered and elucidated, called the genetic code, that allows them to transmit information. And Crick in 57 already is seeing this, that they must be transmitting information for building the crucial proteins that do all the important jobs in the cell. So you have digital information directing the construction of mechanical systems or mechanical parts that are doing jobs in the cell. That's in outline what he perceives in 1957, and that's called the sequence hypothesis. It takes about 8 years to confirm that brilliant insight. So it's kind of conjecture in 57. By 65, molecular biologists have pretty much confirmed that that's actually what's going on inside cells. You've got digital code directing the construction of these proteins that are doing all these important jobs. And so you've got the information revolution comes to biology. And from that point forward, evolutionary theory comes under pressure. In 1966, there's a famous conference at the Wistar Institute that's convened by leading mathematically inclined scientists, physicists, mathematicians, many from MIT, who are saying to their biology colleagues, well, if what you guys are telling us about what's going on inside cells is true, we're not quite sure how your Darwinian theory works anymore, because you're relying on random mutations. And what we know is that random changes in, say, computer code will degrade that code long before you get a new program or operating system.
And so we don't see how it's going to work.
Yeah.
But the problem is even more acute at the point of the origin of life. How do you get that first informational, to build a cell,
Yes.
you need proteins. To build proteins, you need DNA full of information. Where does that information
That's
come
right.
from? And thus an impasse descends upon origin of life research.
Yeah, and of course, whatever explanatory power Darwin's theory has, it's not going to apply at the origin of life. You're going to need reproducing populations for that to play. And so I don't want to run out the clock on the scientific details. Okay, but you also, of course, talk about the history of life, that there's evidence of design in the history of life. And of course, you're not arguing that natural selection and random genetic mutations don't explain anything. You're arguing that they just don't do anything like a complete job of explaining what needs to be explained.
Right. The Darwinian mechanism, I think increasingly this is recognized by leading evolutionary biologists themselves, that the Darwinian mechanism of natural selection and random mutation do a nice job of explaining how systems might be a small-scale variation or optimization of pre-existing systems, but that mechanism does a poor job of explaining the origin of new forms of life, what's called morphological innovation. In the history of life, in the fossil record, we see these big bursts of innovation. Completely new forms, from the first animals in the Cambrian to the first winged insects, or first turtles, or first birds, or first mammals, or first flowering plants. All these events in the history of life, as revealed by the fossil record, emerge without discernible ancestral forms in the preceding sedimentary layers. So they're bursts of creativity. And to build a new form, just as in our computer world, if you want to give your computer new code, you've got to give it, if you want to give it a new function, you've got to provide new code. And the same thing turns out to be true in biology. If you want to build a new form of life, you have to have new anatomical features, new tissues, new cell types, new proteins. You've got to have new information in DNA and probably in other sources. So to build something, to get new form, you need new information. And so the problem of the origin of information repeats or recurs over and over again in the history of life, from the origin of the first life and then all the way up the stratigraphic column, if you will.
And so that now sets up your argument, which is different from, if people are used to sort of traditional arguments for God's existence, it starts with premises and tries to sort of deductively prove God's existence. You don't do that, do you? You're saying there's another way to kind of understand this evidence that still points in a theistic direction.
Right. I left for grad school in, well, it was back in the nursery times.
That's right.
Yeah. And it was 86. And I had been exposed to some of the scientists who were first thinking about this idea of intelligent design. Charles Thaxton, Dean Kenyon, Walter Bradley, and others. And I was really intrigued with it, but not yet convinced. One of their claims was that, well, there are different ways of reasoning scientifically. There's historical ways of reasoning scientifically. And so I ended up doing my PhD research on origin of life biology, and with a specific focus on explicating the method of reasoning that scientists use when they're trying to reconstruct events in the remote past.
Yes.
And it turns out there is a different method of reasoning. It's sometimes called the method of multiple competing hypotheses. It's different than a scientist working in the laboratory who has the luxury of repeating an experiment under controlled laboratory conditions. Okay. And so
it's like this historical science.
It's historical
You're
science.
reconstructing
And so there's another way of talking about that. It's called inferring to the best explanation. This method of reasoning is used commonly in many sciences, but especially in the historical sciences. And a big question that arose is, well, what does it mean to be a best explanation if you're trying to explain an event in the remote past? And it turns out that one of Darwin's colleagues, the great geologist Charles Lyell, had worked this out. And it was a criterion that's been now used just intuitively by scientists. And that is that the best explanation is one that uniquely posits a cause which is known to produce the effect in question. If you posit a cause which you know is the only known cause of a given effect, and you see that effect but didn't observe how the effect came to be, you can infer the effect from the cause. If it's true that where there's smoke, there's fire, if you see smoke wafting over the beyond the far hillside, you know there's a fire below. So I got to thinking, well, what is this was Lyell's phrase, what is the cause now in operation for the production of digital information? And I knew that in biology generally, mutation and selection didn't do it, because mutations degrade information before they generate new information. But in the origin of life area, it was even more, the conundrum, the mystery of the origin of information was even more acute. All the different materialistic attempts to explain the origin of information, scientists trying to get from chemistry to code, all those explanations had failed. And yet there was a cause of which we know that is capable of producing information. And one of the early scientists who was applying the tools of information science to analyzing molecular biology, his name was Henry Quasler. In an offhand quotation, his observation says, the creation of new information is habitually associated with conscious activity.
Wow.
And I thought, well, is that true? And then I thought, well, hieroglyphic inscriptions, paragraphs in books, information in a radio signal. We know of no exception to that rule. Whenever we see information and we trace it back to its ultimate source, we always come to a mind, not a material process. Right. So using this method of inference to the best explanation, I developed a positive argument for intelligent design, that the digital code that we see in the DNA is the product, is best explained by a prior intelligence because there's only one known cause of the production of information, and that's mind. Just to cinch the point, Bill Gates says that DNA is like a computer program, but much more complex than any we've ever created. Well, where does computer code come from? It comes from programmers.
Right.
And so what I've argued is that we're looking at evidence for a master programmer in the history of life.
And then in this book, in your conclusion, you bring all of this together to go not just design, but okay, what would be the adequate designer that we could have for the whole show?
What type of designer could explain the origin of the digital code? Well, maybe a designer within the cosmos for that, because that arises long after the beginning. But if you bring in then the fine-tuning of the universe from the beginning and the, as best we can tell, fact that the universe itself had a beginning, then we need a designing agent who can act, who exists independently of the universe to bring the whole universe into existence. And who is also then active in the creation long after the beginning, unlike a deistic creator. So I look at it's a kind of a game of, what's that old reality show where people got kicked off the island? You know, I look at the different metaphysical hypotheses.
Because you do theism, deism, pantheism, materialism, all the kind of,
I look at all the different metaphysical systems or worldviews and ask which one is adequate to explain the ensemble of evidence that we now have about biological, physical, and cosmological origins. And theism ends up uniquely adequate in that philosophical evaluation or examination.
Yeah, and so it's terrific about this, and that brings us really to the title of our event, is God is a public truth. Nothing you have said is sectarian. We're talking about the evidence of nature. You're using widely accepted forms of reasoning.
Exactly. That's one of the keys. Is I'm actually using the same method of reasoning that Darwin used in The Origin of Species. So sometimes people want to say intelligent design is not scientific. Well, if they say that, they would also have to say that the theory of evolution is not a scientific theory because we're using the same methods of reasoning that were used to formulate that theory.
Absolutely. So why should public policy people care about this particular debate and these findings?
Well, I used to teach political philosophy as well as philosophy of science, and one of the figures that's, I think, very crucial to understanding our current moment in the United States are the post-secularization context in which we live. I mean, there was a point because of various legal opinions that were rendered, as you point out, that we moved in a more secularized understanding of our polity, of our public policy. One of the figures that was crucial to that was the political philosopher John Rawls. And Rawls had this notion of public reasons. And his notion of public reasons are reasons for a public policy or reasons for a legal precedent that can be affirmed by all persons irrespective of worldview. So if there's any disagreement among people holding different worldviews about a political, about a reason for adopting a policy, those are ruled out of court, literally. We cannot include those in our public discourse. Then the public sphere needs to be, or the public square needs to be, as Richard John Neuhaus put it, naked. Free of contentious worldview propositions, so that we can only affirm things that as reasons for doing something that we all agree on. Now, there's a certain sense where that makes sense, okay? And you and I both argued for example, limitations on abortion that are based on scientific evidence that we now have about when a fetus can experience pain. And people across various worldviews will agree, yeah, if we wouldn't do that to our dogs or our cats, we shouldn't do it to a human fetus. And so that makes, and I think that's part of the reason that there's a wide political consensus against late-term abortions, okay? But there's something about Rawls's notion of a worldview-free public sphere that doesn't quite hold up, and it's incoherent at a deep level, because Rawls, like many political liberals, wants to affirm the notion of universal human rights. He wants to affirm freedom, equality, and fairness as public values, but he forgets that our notions of freedom, which are closely tied to our notions of human rights, derive from a specific worldview context. It was a context in which our notion of human rights comes from the notion of the Latin idea of dignitas, that we have an inherent, each human being has an inherent dignity that cannot be stripped from him or her by the state, by the government, because we are made in the image of God. That the dignity that we have as human beings is derivative of our status of being creatures that are specially made by our Creator. So, in other words, if we go back to our founding, we have this idea that all men are created equal and endowed by their Creator with certain inalienable rights. Well, our notion of rights comes from a particular worldview context. It comes from the idea that there is a Creator that can be known by reason, but that's part of our public knowledge.
Right.
Okay, so even Jefferson talked about nature's God.
Absolutely.
Okay? Well, why nature's God? Why is the God nature? Well, because we know of God by examining nature. And so we have this contentious worldview proposition that there is a Creator, and that Creator has made us in some way either in His image, as religious people would say, or has granted us a dignity that means that we have rights that should not be abridged by the state or by anyone. But not everyone agrees that there is a Creator.
No, that's right.
Certainly not today.
But everybody wants to keep the fruit of the tree.
Exactly.
And that's why this is crucial, because it revives the tree and the trunk.
It revives the worldview consensus that was the basis of our political system, and indeed the rights that we prize.
Yes.
And the Rawlsian contemporary secular liberal idea is, in the end, it's not only unstable, it's proving itself to be unstable, because there is a worldview vacuum that will inevitably get filled. If you want to say, well, but see, part of the paradox of the whole Rawlsian liberalism is the idea that you must not talk about, you must not offer as a reason for a public course of action any reason that is not universally affirmed by all people of all worldviews. Well, that's an impossible standard to meet.
Yeah.
And
in fact, it's self-refuting, because if you don't agree with Rawls, right?
Yes, exactly.
Then it doesn't fit his own criteria.
It doesn't fit his own criteria. And so what happened, and this is why Richard John Neuhaus wrote the book, The Naked Public Square, is that the public square cannot be naked. There needs to be a set of basic premises that most members of the society agree on at a deep worldview level. That's why the American experiment worked so well for so long, is that we did believe that there were inalienable rights that had been granted to us by a Creator. But now, if you want to talk about the existence of a Creator in a public school, you will get sued by the American Civil Liberties Union or other similar groups and told you may not talk about that.
That's right.
And so we have this weird contradiction.
Well, we do, but it's based on the false assumption that we can't actually have knowledge of God. So you can't have public evidence of God's existence. That's why I think, frankly, this is always such a controversial topic, is that I think people on the other side sort of realize that. They want to keep us in our boxes. So I don't want to run out the clock without doing Q&A. So
can I make one more comment before you do that?
30 seconds, because they're going to be mad because they want to ask questions. All right.
We'll go from political philosophy to philosophy of science and philosophy of religion. Philosophers have a definition of knowledge. They say knowledge is justified true belief. The question is, can you have justified true belief of God? And what I want to argue is, yes, you can, and the argument that I make in the book provides that, in which case then we have public knowledge of a Creator, and people who are convinced of that are within their rights to contend for what flows from that in the realm of public policy, which is the protection of universal human rights. It's not theocracy.
No,
we're not arguing
no,
for
absolutely not.
theocracy.
Yeah.
But we're saying that you can have a theistically informed worldview, or you can have a scientifically informed worldview that affirms theism, and that has positive consequences for our public life.
Absolutely. Perfect. All right, so we take questions here. So the microphone is here, and so we'll just start right here with this. And so please give us little concise questions so we can get through as many as we can.
Hello there. My question involves kind of more recent discoveries, such as the universe not being locally real. That was the big headline not that long ago. It seems to me that what we're talking about is fundamentally what is primary is the information. I know that that's been expressed as information theory by certain philosophers and individuals. I'm just curious as your thoughts on that. Is what is primary both in the universe and in ourselves, the information, and is that really being encoded?
You're arguing for the origin of the information.
Yeah, I would say that in the 19th century, the scientific metaphysics, the metaphysics of science was to affirm that there were two fundamental realities. There was matter and there was energy. And the great discovery of the second half of the 20th century, both in the information sciences with figures like Claude Shannon, but in biology as well, and now in our whole computer revolution, is that there's a third fundamental entity that's crucial, and that's information. We buy it, we sell it, we send it down wires, we recognize its reality in many different ways. And crucially, it's present, it's necessary to make life possible. It's necessary to make the universe possible. And that then raises the question, well, where does that third fundamental reality come from? And what we know from our uniform and repeated experience, which is the basis of all scientific reasoning, is that information always comes from a mind. And so I think we're looking at very powerful scientific evidence for the reality, not just of matter and energy, but for a mind that precedes it and shapes it to produce all the things that we see around us.
Terrific, thanks. Down front here. I'm told that I ignore people on the right, so that's why I've started over here.
Jay, I thought you ignored people on the left.
No, I know.
Actually, I'm sitting on the left, but
okay.
I appreciate you considering me to be on the right. The Declaration of Independence holds as a self-evident truth that we have been endowed by the Creator with certain unalienable rights. Now that would seem, that to me entails that it's a self-evident truth that there is a Creator. Our nation was built upon the foundation that the Creator is a self-evident truth. Given the existence is self-evident, can't we teach about mention the Creator in the schools? Seems like the fact that it's a self-evident truth, that's the founding premise of our nation, self-evident that the Creator exists. It seems to me, since it's a self-evident truth, we should, in our national policy, just, teach kids about the Creator.
So how about that, Steve? So if it's self-evident, why bother writing big, thick books like this?
Well, that's a completely different question, actually. It's no longer self-evident to many scientists, and the consensus coming out of the late 19th century was a consensus among elite intellectuals, especially scientists, was in favor of a worldview that scholars call scientific materialism. That matter and energy are the things from which everything else comes. They are the self-existent entities that provide the basis of all explanation.
Yes.
And the interesting thing, when you do worldview comparisons or studies, every worldview has to answer that question. What is the thing or the entity or the process from which everything else came? And the consensus view among elite intellectuals coming out of the 19th century was it's matter and energy. And so the reason the book needed to be written was to challenge that, because the science of the 20th century and the early 21st century is pointing in a very different non-materialistic direction. I think materialism as a worldview is completely failing, and not just looking at cosmology and biology and the origins of life and the origins of the universe, but also looking at questions about, for example, the nature of the human mind and the mind-body question and things like that. The question about public policy as it applies to education, there is this deep paradox, and that is that on the one hand, our system, including our system of rights, liberties, is based on the presumption of the existence of a transcendent, and I would say benevolent Creator who endows us with dignity and therefore that dignity is the reason that we must preserve the rights of human beings. But on the other, this, late 20th century secularization of our legal system and political system that means that has adopted the Rawlsian idea that the public sphere must be free of any religiously informed concept, such that now we can't, and therefore we're going to forbid discussion of the reality of a creator or even an intelligent designer or even any policy that might follow as an implication of a belief in that. That also can't be discussed in the public sphere. And so we have this paradox where our system of rights and liberties is based on a worldview that can no longer be discussed.
Yeah.
And I think that's unstable.
Absolutely.
And I think one of the, without getting into the details of the public policies that we favor and don't favor for public education, I think that's one of the important things about this whole movement of scientists and philosophers who are now saying, no, wait a minute, there are strong public reasons for believing in the reality of God, and therefore the premise of our whole system is not unstable. It's not irrational. It can be affirmed, and therefore we can return to that sort of theistic pluralism that our founders envisioned, where not a theocracy, we're not going to base every public policy on Holy Writ, but we're going to say we have a common worldview, and within that worldview, there will be liberties affirmed because of that worldview that allow us to work out the details of public policy in a pluralistic manner, where we respect differences, but we also affirm that there are certain basic principles in the absence of which we cannot exist as a free people.
Right. Wonderful. All right, so over here, take this one.
Is there incompatibility between the God of the Gaps hypothesis and the scrutability needed for open political debate?
Okay, a couple of things there.
Okay, not sure I concede the premise about the God of the Gaps hypothesis, although you might be you might be subtly critiquing it in the way you frame it. So let me just take the God of the Gaps thing first. It's often said that the argument for intelligent design is a, quote, God of the Gaps argument. You're invoking God because, quote, science has failed or has yet to come up with an adequate explanation. So another way of formulating that's a way of expressing the argument that you, proponents of intelligent design, are committing the informal logical fallacy, or the fallacy from informal logic of an argument from ignorance. Cause A is not sufficient to produce effect X, therefore cause B must have done it. That's fallacious, right? Because just because cause A can't do it doesn't mean that you have positive evidence that cause B can do it, right? And so if we were arguing that way, that would be a gaps argument or an argument from ignorance. But we're not actually arguing that way. We're saying that cause A is insufficient to produce, various types of naturalistic or materialistic processes have shown themselves to be inadequate to produce information, but we do know of another cause that does routinely produce information, and that cause is an intelligent agent. So we have positive knowledge of a type of cause which is sufficient. Therefore, when we infer that cause from the effect when we find it, the effect being information, we're not arguing from ignorance, but rather from knowledge of the cause and effect structure of the world. So that's why we say we're making an inference to the best explanation, not a God of the Gaps argument or an argument from ignorance. So there's a tension between God of the Gaps reasoning and the kind of reasoning that we do, in that we reject one and affirm the other. But then you also asked another, sorry.
Scrutability required for, I forget what I said.
Yeah, no, okay.
So public policy.
Yeah, this is actually an excellent way of framing this, because if we were just making a case for God based on the failure of materialistic causes to account for certain key features of the universe, then we wouldn't have strong public reasons for affirming the existence of an intelligent designer or a designer with the attributes that Jews and Christians have long associated with God. Okay, so we wouldn't have a strong public argument for God. So yes, there would be a tension between a God of the Gap style argument and affirming theism as a foundation for our system of rights and liberties. But if there's a strong positive argument for God, then we have congruence between the two, and a good reason for saying, hey, I as a theist should not be embarrassed or have my hands tied in asserting the relevance of my worldview to public policy.
That's great. Yes, back here.
As a student at Georgetown University many years ago, I attended a debate one time to which I've never heard a good response, and I'd like to give you an opportunity to. It was a debate between a materialist and someone who believed in a creator. And one of the points they made is sort of founded on the notion that if you give a monkey a typewriter in all eternity, the monkey will eventually type out the entire text of the Bible perfectly. And so the point is that with enough infinity number of opportunities, you will get something to happen. And the proposition has been, and I'd like to hear your response to it, that there are in fact an unlimited number of universes. The universe that we happen to inhabit is one that experienced a red shift, which meant that it was expanding, which meant that you could then deduct that there was a point at which it exploded.
And planets,
blah, blah, blah. So that if there are an unlimited number of
Yeah.
universes, could that not be a natural phenomenon? And we just happen to be in the one
so
out
glad
of
you asked
trillions
this.
that.
Yeah.
I'm so excited that we're going to have 3 minutes to respond to this.
Okay, so here's the multiverse idea. This is known as the multiverse, okay? And it's been proposed as an explanation for the fine-tuning of the laws and constants of physics and the initial conditions of the universe, okay? It's been proposed for other reasons as well. I should acknowledge that to the physicists in the audience, but it is now the go-to materialistic explanation for the origin of the universe and the fine-tuning of the universe and all the improbable things that happen downstream. But there's a problem with it. And that is, if we just have these other universes, and there's no causal connection between those universes and our universe, then just invoking those other universes doesn't explain anything that happens in our universe, including whatever process was responsible for setting the incredibly improbable, finely tuned conditions of our universe. So in virtue of that, multiverse proponents have had to propose what are called universe-generating mechanisms. There has to be a common cause of our universe and those other universes so that our universe can be portrayed as the lucky winner in a giant cosmic lottery so that the multiverse explanation will work. But that's where the ultimate rub comes in, because it turns out that those universe-generating mechanisms, whether they're based on something called string theory or inflationary cosmology or some other yet-to-be-determined universe-generating mechanism, those universe-generating mechanisms necessarily and invariably require prior unexplained fine-tuning in order for them even to, in theory, to generate new universes. So to go back to your monkey at the typewriter example, the monkey at the typewriter would eventually type out the Bible or all the works of Shakespeare, provided that the keys on the typewriter are designed in such a way to strike the ribbon, and that there is, if we have to be or not to be, that is the question, provided that there's a T among the keys. In other words, even the typewriter example presupposes a fine-tuning in the thing that's producing the outcome, okay? And that ends up being true of all the universe-generating mechanisms that have been proposed. And so I don't think the multiverse, there may be other universes. I'm not going to the mat to say that there isn't. I'm skeptical, but not adamantly opposed. But even if there are other universes, the multiverse explanation only works if there is prior fine-tuning, and that takes you right back to where you started, unexplained prior fine-tuning. And what we call fine-tuning in our experience is if a system is finely tuned, it's a system that has multiple improbable parameters that jointly work to accomplish a functional outcome. And every system we know, whether it's a finely tuned French recipe or a finely tuned internal combustion engine or a finely tuned section of digital code, all such systems arise from intelligent agents. So if there's unexplained fine-tuning with the multiverse hypothesis, it takes you right back to the need for an intelligent designer.
He did it in 3 minutes, and with that miracle, let's thank Steve Meyer. Thank you. So those of you in person, feel free to join us for lunch right outside here in the foyer. Thank you.
1 hour on the dot. That was great, Jay. We covered